Recording now, and I'm going to hand over to Lois.
Thanks very much, Anna, and thanks to the committee for giving me the opportunity to talk about rural development and ideas from the Japanese uplands. I imagine that some of you are thinking, how the hell did she get to Japan? Well, I was very fortunate to be awarded a Churchill Fellowship in 2018, and I travelled to Japan in 2019. And I went for 4 weeks, and I visited a range of farms and farmers in the uplands of Japan, and there'll be a map a bit later to show you where I went. And I met various people in the ministry in Tokyo, including the Minister of Agriculture and the Minister for Environment. And then I also visited a few academics to dish the real dirt on what was going on, because obviously ministries like to think that everything's perfect and it's all working beautifully. And I was interested to hear what the critique of what was going on as well before I went out into the field to meet with a range of farmers and a range of development officers. So I travelled around Japan for 4 weeks. For those of you that are a bit impressed with that, I can't speak Japanese. I can say about 5 words. So good evening is konbanwa. So konbanwa to everybody. And basically, I had an interpreter with me, and that's one of the lessons that if you choose to travel in Japan, do any work at all in any capacity or visit farms or whatever, you do need to have an interpreter, because rural Japan is completely different from urban Japan. In urban Japan, you will find people who do speak English, although it can be a bit fragmented, but generally the urban population are conversant with English, whereas in rural areas, it's extremely unusual to meet anybody that speaks English or can understand English. So you actually must have an interpreter with you. So what I went out there to do was to learn about Japanese uplands and how they use cultural capital and rural development to help support and maintain their hill farming sector. So that's specifically what I was interested in. My research interest is upland agriculture specifically, and I've been looking at that for 25 years. But I'm not an ivory tower academic. I'm absolutely interested in making a real difference and trying to learn ways in which we can help the hill farming communities in this country. So I'm quite unusual in that respect. So onwards and upwards, as they say. So thank you for joining this session. So probably the most important thing that I learnt in Japan is that food is absolutely central to how they think about their agriculture. And that is very different to Western European countries, particularly in the UK, where food is just seen as something we need in order to eat it. Whereas in Japan, it's much more central to their way of life and their culture and how they look on the environment in general. As a consequence, it means that the ministry sees food production as a core element of their rural development. And that's very different, again, from the UK and even from the European Union. So you can see from this rough diagram that I've put together is that food is seen as the central thing, and it's seen as the way to actually access and develop all these different areas. So the whole idea of food is central to their rural economy. So they see it as a lever for employment. They see it as a way to improve community cohesion, look at their social education for their children, and those people from urban areas who miss out in rural areas. They see it as a lever for landscape tourism and so on and so forth. So it's absolutely core. And that was the first thing that I learned, is that it's completely different to what goes on in the UK and many Western economies. It's that importance of food. And so food is very central. So they spend a lot of time thinking about it because they are obsessed with food. And for those of you that have travelled to Japan before, you will know they are completely obsessed with food. And you'll see that as a theme as we run through this set of PowerPoint slides. So what I set out to do was really to try and learn about 3 things, really. Is I wanted to understand how upland farming systems compare between Japan and the UK, so that I can understand what parallels there were and what contrasts there were, to try and work out what we could learn from them. Secondly, I needed to understand what the challenges were in rural Japan. Are they any different to the UK? And then thirdly, what could we learn that I could bring back here to then distribute in many possible ways as possible about what we can learn from them that we could benefit from and amalgamate perhaps, or learn lessons from, that we could actually do something in this country. And so since I've come back last year, I've spent a lot of time talking to farmers groups, community groups, village committees, the National Trust, the Environment Agency, National Park. I'm willing to talk to anybody. So this is an evangelism exercise for me. So this is why I was really keen to talk at the conferences, because this provides me with an opportunity to talk to a lot of other people as well who can see the benefit of perhaps learning from other cultures, which is the point of a Churchill Fellowship, is what can we learn from other cultures that we can bring back and actually use to actually improve our situation in this country. So there were the three things I set out to do. And the first thing is, obviously, I need to understand whether their farming system is similar or different. And here are some shock figures for everybody, is that 40% of agriculture in Japan comes from the uplands, and 40% of the agricultural population live there. So that's incredibly different to the UK. So because of that, you can see immediately that the Japanese government have to pay attention to the community in rural areas, because it has such a big impact in uplands specifically. So they can't neglect it. They can't hide from the issues that the area is producing, and that they need to tackle them. So in the UK, this is a very sort of classic hill farm for people. Some of you might recognise it. It's a very famous farm on the M6 corridor as you come up through Cumbria, which is where I'm based. And it's a very famous farm in the bottom of the valley, and then the fell up behind it. And in Japan, the areas it's similar. So you get a mountain area, but it's different, as they say. It's similar but different. So the lowland areas in Japan, they're privately owned. The fields are divided up into small fields, and it's intensively farmed. Now, when I use the word intensive, it's much more intensive in Japan than it is in the UK, and that's an important difference to recognise. But in relation to the UK, the in-by land at the bottom of the fell is used in the most intensive way in comparison to the land further up the fell. So I was trying to draw parallels, but understanding that there were differences in there as well. The upper areas, this is where there are very greater similarities, is that they are communally operated in Japan, and they lack boundaries. Most of it's extensive production, whereas in the UK, we tend to have one owner with many commoners. In Japan, the system is different because the community own the land at the top of the hills, at the top of the mountains. So it's a community asset rather than a common asset. So it's slightly different. So when they come to make decisions about the upper areas of their land, they actually have to work communally as a community to decide what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. And that's where the variation starts to occur. So it's roughly similar, but different. But that's one of the reasons I travelled to Japan, is because I didn't want to go and look at upland areas in Western Europe or in Australia or North America or Canada, because you tend to get very similar sorts of systems evolving. And what I wanted to see was something completely different, because if you think about it, we've spent the last 40 or 50 years trying to come up with ways to help support the hill farming community and create community resilience. And none of it, quite frankly, has worked very well. So we need new lessons and new ideas. So I wanted to go to somewhere that was so different, and they looked at the land, and they looked at ideas in a completely different way. And even philosophically, they look at land in a very different way, in the environment, to try and tease out those things that perhaps we could come back and then learn from in the UK. And you might say, well, isn't that a bit too radical? But it's interesting, because talking to the Japanese ministry people, they spend a lot of time in Western Europe and the UK learning about how we do things, and then they take it back to Japan and then they adapt it. So to me, it was an opportunity for me to go there and then try and get some of this stuff back here and try and see what we could make of it. So for Japan, in the uplands, they have three main issues. First of all, they've undergone extreme rural depopulation since in the last 50 years. And in fact, they've lost 82% of their labour in upland areas since 1945, since the end of the war. And so their depopulation, I suppose the equivalent is it's how we lost the people in the rural areas in the 19th century in the UK. So some of the issues are the same and some are different. So there is labour loss, and they do understand the importance of labour loss. And this is an interesting photograph. This is a classic abandoned farm in upland Japan, and everywhere you go in Japan, you see farms abandoned. And what's happened is they've literally shut the front door and gone to work in the urban areas because that's where they think all the jobs are and the money are. And a lot of the young people end up in urban areas and they leave the elderly behind. And the elderly then can't manage the farm, and then it becomes a problem for the state to look after both the farmland and the farming population. The second issue they've had massive land abandonment in Japan since 1945, where 71% of the uplands have been abandoned. And so as a consequence, a lot of the upland areas that were farmed have been taken over back by the trees, and the trees have grown back, and it's gone back into what I suppose you could consider secondary woodland. And that's caused problems because obviously it means that fields that were cleared are now covered in trees, and therefore it makes it more difficult for farms to be economic in size. The other problem they've got is in the uplands of Japan, the population is massively aging, and 30% of them are over 65. And the average age of a farmer in Japan, in upland Japan, is 73. And the issue is what happens is that all the young people leave and they go to the urban areas. They work there until perhaps 55, and then they go home back to the rural area they came from to retire. And they retire as a farmer, and that's what they do for the rest of their life. And there were Japanese farmers that I met that were in their 90s and they were still farming. And a lot of it is manual farming. It's not machinery farming because of the angle of the slopes of the land. So it's really hard work. And it's just mind-blowing that their farming system is still continuing and they're still producing food, even though their population is massively distorted, so that in rural areas, the bulk of the population are over 65 and there's hardly anybody who's under 30. I met 2 people the entire time that I was in rural Japan that were under the age of 30, and thereby hangs the tale. And the other issue that Japan's had is that increasingly their diet has become westernized. So as where they would used to rely on rice as their main crop, and everybody grew rice, and that was an easy supply and demand for the farming economy. Increasingly, wheat has become much more sought after by young people. So instead of eating rice, they want to eat wheat product. And in 2011, for the first time, wheat sales outstripped rice sales in Japan. And that had a fundamental impact on the culture of Japan, because Japan is a culture built on rice. A lot of their cultural traditions are based on rice. They have lots of festivals and lots of activities revolved around the rice harvest and planting rice and looking after rice and managing the landscape for rice. And then to be in a situation where rice was declining massively, and instead you've got a westernized diet that is encouraging wheat production. And that has an impact on their balance of trade as well, because they're having to ship a lot of it in rather than grow it themselves, because they just don't have the landscape to grow wheat, because most of Japan is mountains and most of the population live on the periphery between literally the ocean and the mountains. And of course, that's all the earthquake zone as well. So there are some similarities and there are some differences. So the place I went to, and I apologize for the tiny little map, but there's a black map of Japan. And if you're unfamiliar with it, it's got one main big island, a triangular island off the top, and then a string of smaller islands running off the south of the archipelago. And I went to one small area. It looks ridiculous now. Japan's absolutely colossal. It's 4 times the size of the British Isles, and the population is about 130 million. So I went to what's known as the Yoshino-Kumano National Park in the Key Peninsula. So the Key Peninsula is basically a just giant piece of land, with mountains basically, and farming. That's it really, and tourism. And the reason I chose that is because I was trying to understand the differences between national parks in Japan and farming that went on in national parks in Japan, and farming and national parks that go on in the UK, because my specialist area of interest is Cumbria and uplands in the north of England. So I was trying to compare those areas that had national parks with areas in Japan that had national parks, to try and eliminate as many factors as possible, so that I could really try and understand what the opportunities were for farmers back here in designated landscapes and other uplands. So the total area of Yoshino-Kumano is about 65,000 hectares, which is roughly the same size as the Lake District, for those of you. It was designated as a national park in 1936, and its maximum altitude is much much higher than the any fells in this country. At 2,000 metres ASL is the top. And the agricultural land use, and this will be the shock to everybody, they don't have any livestock. It's a completely different farming system. It's forestry at the top, fruit and trees in the middle with rice, and then on the lower land it's vegetables. And that again was a deliberate choice by me, because I wanted to look at other ways of looking for ideas. If I went to a meat area, you'd tend to see similar things. I wanted something completely different, because I think we need to start looking at other farming systems and the other issues to try and help us understand what we can do and how we can diversify the hill farming economy in different ways. The other thing about Yoshino-Kumano is it contains a number of World Heritage sites, but it's not in any way similar to the Lake District, which some of you will know. The bulk of the Lake District is actually a World Heritage site as well. So I was trying to draw some comparisons, but also allow for some contrasts to get me to understand what we could do and what was possible and what was ridiculous, because obviously there are things that I saw that would not work in hill farming areas in this country. So running through a few of the things that I saw, of course the most obvious is that people do, oh sorry, I've touched my buttons too much there, I beg your pardon. There we go. No, it's going to play up with me. Come on. There we go. Obviously, everybody looks at new enterprises when they try to diversify, and these are just three that I chose to stimulate conversation more than anything else. And the first thing they do is they do something which the nearest translation is rent-a-paddy. And what happens is, because the urban people have left the rural areas, they no longer have that cultural link with where they've cut the rural areas where they've come from. They no longer have that link. So what farmers do in rural areas in Upland Japan is they rent paddies out to urban families. So urban families will come and help plant the rice, and then they go away and the farmer tends it for the year. And then when it's harvest time, they go back and they help harvest it, and they engage with all the cultural activities related to harvesting in relation to the events and festivals. And then they take a percentage of the rice home, and then they put it on the table for their guests and so on and so forth. And this is a very de rigueur thing to do in Japan, is to impress people with the quality of your food. So to actually say, yes, we grew this on our own rice paddy in the Uplands is actually seen as it's almost like a status symbol. And so some of these rice paddies that I was looking at belong to various ministers within the Ministry of Agriculture and within the Japanese government. At the time, Shinzo Abe, who was the Prime Minister, he had a rice paddy, and then when he has visitors come from abroad, he said, this is rice that's grown in the uplands of Japan. So they have a great deal of pride in their local produce and the importance of their cultural produce. And saying, when people come and visit them from other nations, they say, look, this is the food we grow. And to them, that's a really important cultural thing, is to say, we grow our own food, this is the food, this is Japan, this is what Japan's about. So rent-a-paddy was an interesting one. Perhaps we could have rent-a-sheep, I don't know, if you want the front end or the back end. The second thing that they do is, obviously like we do over here, is they look at high-value crops that they could grow. And interestingly, the two that I looked at is wasabi, which is that hot stuff that people put on sushi, which is actually a hydroponic crop. And they grow it in the uplands at very high altitude. And we could actually grow wasabi in this country, because I looked at the climatic conditions for growing wasabi, and we can grow it up here because it's a hydroponic system, and you just need to set up the hydroponics. And basically it's a root that grows in water with its sort of tendrils at the bottom, I've forgotten what they call, rootlets, are actually in a sort of a sandy sediment at the bottom. So you set up these tanks and it grows for 2 years, and then you can go and harvest it. And the premium on wasabi is massive. And I know they grow wasabi in Hampshire, in this country, and there's one location, and it's secret because this stuff commands such a high price that if you know where it's located, they have lots of thefts of wasabi, with people basically running into the uplands and trying to steal it and run off with it, because it's some of it, the quality is like £600 for a pound of wasabi. So it commands a very high price, particularly if it's grown in the Japanese uplands, because it has kudos, that it's grown naturally in a natural environment rather than in a hydroponic lab or in an agri-tech barn. So we could grow things like wasabi. The other thing we could grow as well is shiitake mushrooms, because basically you can grow shiitake mushrooms outside on logs, and these are oak logs all stacked up, or you can actually use a shed. As long as you have a warm through flow of air, you can produce shiitake mushrooms. So you can do that anywhere. And again, talking to the shiitake mushroom farmer in the Uplands, and I was explaining about the climatic conditions in Upland, UK, he said, yeah, there's no problem. You could grow shiitake mushrooms either inside or outside. Excuse me, my telephone's ringing. Sorry about that. That's the reality of being in a conference call in your kitchen. That's what happens. Excuse me. So we could grow high quality crops. It's just a case of looking at how to do it and learning how to do it. And I think we could do some of these things. The last thing that they're very keen on, they've started to develop, is hands-on agri-tourism experiences. So opening up opportunities for people from other countries to learn about how their food is produced by actually sort of getting involved in the process. And this is an elderly couple who are both over 80, and one day a week they do a hands-on agri-tourism experience of making something called mochi, which is sort of like pounded rice. That's what it is, heated pounded rice, and it turns into this goo, and it's a delicacy in Japan. But it allowed you to experience and understand their issues. You got to talk to them. They made you a meal. You went round and looked at the rice paddies and understood the rice cultivation system. So again, it's that interface between the indigenous population and the tourist population. And I think we need to make more of that. I don't think we make enough of that at all. Come on, wake up. They obviously do added value. Again, we do all sorts of stuff over here. So just to give you a feel for the sorts of things, their big thing is making it look good. This is Japanese food, the high-end quality stuff. They exploit variety. That's the first thing they do. So they have 74 different types of orange, can you believe, that they grow? So variety is really important to them. So they squeeze and bottle the juice separately so that people can buy different variety. So it's a bit like buying apple juice in this country, or Perry or whatever. The other thing they do is that for them, what food looks like before you eat it is absolutely crucial, because if it looks fabulous, then you're going to eat it. And to put it bluntly, it could taste like shit, but if it looks good, then it's absolutely the most important thing in relation to their culture. And the photographs at the bottom here on the left, that is a train-packed lunch. I got that in the railway station at what is equivalent to their sandwich bar. So the idea of food being really important. Can you imagine having that on a Virgin West train or GNER? The quality is just mind-blowing. It's about presentation. It's about wanting to eat the food and encouraging people to eat it. The box was beautifully done, and so on and so forth. And it was very cheap. It was just like buying a packet of sandwiches in this country. So it's completely different attitude to food and how to encourage the population to engage with the food that they produce in their own country. And then the urban sales outlets were just mind-blowing. And this was in a railway station in the middle of nowhere. And this was the display of food for people to go and purchase local food. So instead of trying to have local food outlets near where it's produced, they took it to where the population areas were. So they took it to the railway stations, and then this company collects it up from the local area and then sells it through one outlet where the most people are. So again, perhaps we need to be smarter about how we access populations and sell food. They also run community-run food preparation workshops, so you can go to a local community area and you can experience making food. And again, it's all about that thing, about that connection with food and the importance of food. And then they also do weird things, okay? This is charcoal in food. So they grow the charcoal in the uplands, and then they grind it down into a very fine powder, and then they put it in all sorts of food stuff. So obviously in the bottom there, you've got ice cream, and on the top, you've got pizza with charcoal powder in it. And I have to say, it's some of the most delicious food I've ever eaten. And it's not that unusual, because if you go to Wagamamas in this country, they're actually using charcoal noodles now in a lot of their cooking dishes. So I think we need to be thinking about far more innovation in what we do with our food. And there's no reason why we couldn't produce high quality charcoal in our farm woods and then use it to produce some more innovative foodstuffs. So they put it in ice cream, they put it in biscuits. They're very good at having a go at doing things and seeing what they can make of it. So that brings me on to farm woods, and this is, I think, one of the most interesting areas, is that farm woods are part of their upland farming system, which is known as Satayama, and they are managed for financial benefits. So they see the farm woods as part of their system, and I think that's something we've lost in this country, in the UK, is that connection between the farm and the farm woods. And I appreciate a lot of it is to do with loss in labour and not having enough in the system to actually go and manage the wood. The skills are gone because you have too much, don't have enough time to learn the skills that you need. It's reduced area and it's a mess and it's too much effort to bring it back online. So there are all sorts of reasons why we don't use our farm woods that well in upland areas. But I do think it's an untapped asset, and we need to be looking more carefully at what we do with that. So what they do in Japan is they actually have forest guardians, and this is a forest guardian, and he's responsible for a farm wood, and he works on behalf of the community, and he looks after the farm wood. So again, it's not the farming community running the wood, it's they have somebody who's employed to manage the wood, and he will go round and manage the wood for them. He will select the trees and then create the market for them. And then they do all sorts of things. They obviously make turned wood. They made this entire building. It's an Airbnb that you can go and use, and it's made from indigenous timber. They make sake barrels from it, which is rice wine, fermented rice wine. So I think there's opportunity there that we need to go back and look at our farm woods and think about how we utilise them more effectively. And the issue is labour in upland areas, and I think the things we need to be thinking about is being more creative about how we manage our farm woods. We've got lots of small bits of farm wood and upland, but collectively we could actually perhaps produce charcoal or end up with a peripatetic flying squad of foresters or woodland managers that go around from wood to wood and have a network of woods, getting them back online, getting them to the point where they're maintaining themselves, allowing people to use those farm woods to access other grants and other pots of money that we know are coming in relation to public goods, rather than just leaving them as underutilised and undermanaged resources. So I recognise that labour is one of the biggest issues in upland farms, but I think there are better ways and more sort of innovative ways that we could actually get people onto farms to actually manage the farm wood network that we have. And we all know, it was in the press today, that they want to increase the amount of wood in the UK. And yes, it disrupts the farming system, but it's how you actually put it into the farming system that it doesn't disrupt the farm. But if you're going to put it into the farming system, there has to be a multiple benefit from it, and there has to be an economic return beyond just carbon storage or biodiversity or whatever, and there has to be a financial return. And I think we need to be more clever about how we integrate farm woods back into the upland farm landscape. The other thing they do is that they fund community projects, because they've got a problem with their communities and this massive expanding ancient population of people doddering around, literally. So they have a suite of things that they do. They do things that are very similar to what we've done in this country, which is direct deficiency payments. So they pay farmers money to basically make up the deficiency of not being able to produce goods as well as in the lowland areas. And what they do is that instead of giving the deficiency payment to the individual farmer, they work out how many farmers there are in the community, and then they multiply it up by the deficiency payment, and then they pay the money to the community, and then the community then decide how much, what actual activities the community will do, and then they pay the farmers the money for the direct deficiency payment. And what they've done is they've come over here and they've learnt from LEADER, and that's what they've taken back, is how LEADER works at a community level in a bottom-up way. And they saw that they could use the community system that they have, the village communities, to actually agree what they wanted to do. So they might be paid to cut verges to improve wildlife, they might be encouraged to plant trees, they might be given money to clean drains, but the community decides, but the money comes in based on the number of farmers in the area, and then it's shared out for different projects, and then the farmer in effect gets paid for doing whatever activity the community feel is of most benefit to the community's environment. They also have all sorts of community-run projects. So there are all sorts of food co-ops and all sorts of stuff like that, which are similar to over here. They have a huge wayside community shop network. So there's always, as you're driving along in rural Japan, and you can be in the middle of absolutely nowhere, and you'll come across a community shop, and you can get fuel, you can get local food, you can get a meal, you can get any crafts that the local farmers or the local community produce. It's all in this one location, and that money is then ploughed back into the local community. And the government actually set up a grant scheme to set these up. And so they're absolutely everywhere. Some are absolutely awful and are like little sheds, and others of them are just quite mind-blowing. And they've thought about branding and using the local environment and place-based and sense of place to actually get people to buy products. So you actually have coach loads of Japanese people who go on day trips out of the urban areas, and they go to all these places and they buy local food and they buy local produce, and that's their day out. And then they all get back on the coach and go back to the urban area. But there you go. But people do it for garden centres in this country. So why not do it for local food? It all depends on what the offer is and how you encourage people out of urban areas to re-engage with how their food's produced and good quality food, and that issue of quality rather than quantity that's now being pushed. And they also do a lot of ecotourism stuff with multifunctional facilities. And this is a really interesting one that I visited in the Yoshino area. And it's so well renowned that they have people coming from all over Southeast Asia to visit this particular facility. So they come from Vietnam and Korea, and they come on basically tours to come and see this facility and how the local community have worked together to basically buy an old school. And then they have a cafeteria, and they have a B&B, and they have small IT rooms that people can rent out, and they have training facilities, and they have a food shop and a food hall, and they have community how to make food sessions, and they run courses. But it's allowed the whole community to actually raise its GVA as a collective, and it's created jobs in the local economy, and it's allowed a lot of farmers to continue to farm. So they're working more as a community. And I think, again, they're things, lessons that we can learn is to think more on a community level rather than individually. And that's interesting, because that's a cultural thing in relation to the UK. We don't have such a community, perhaps, spirit that perhaps we used to have. And who knows what will come out of the situation we're currently in. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about is community drivers. And one of the things that I talked about is that young people, there are very few of them. And here are 3 of them that I met when I was in Yoshino-Kumano area in the Key Peninsula. And what they do, the government has, there is no direct translation. The nearest translation I could get was called the Local Community Development Caravan. It's a terrible phrase, but basically what they do is they identify young people who want to live in rural areas. They then pay them a wage, they train them, and they rent them a property in the rural area. And they look for young people that are between 18 and 30. And those people are trained to immerse themselves in the local area and actually help create new projects to drive the GVA up of the area. So the gentleman in the middle was very interested in charcoal production. So he was busy increasing the way in which charcoal was produced in the local area, farm by farm, so that then that raised the GVA of the individual farms. The lady on the right was interested in wasabi. So she was working with wasabi farmers in different parts of the Key Peninsula to get them to produce a better quality product so that they could then sell in the urban markets and raise the value so that they could ship it into the really high class restaurants. And the gentleman on the right, on the left, he was almost worshipped in the local area. This chap went to the US and did his degree and then came back. And he's one of the most important local drivers. He's sort of one of those entrepreneurs and innovators that everybody looks to. And he drives the rest of the community and gets them to engage in projects. And he's involved in this project and that project and the other. So these young people are really quite key. And the Japanese ministry see them not only as helping to drive up the GVA and increase farming profit, but also bringing young people back into the rural areas. And the idea is just hopefully that they love it so much that they settle down and get married and have kids and increase the population. That's what's going on in the background. So they pay them basically to do this job. So that I think is a really interesting one, because we're beginning to see these sorts of key people emerge in some upland areas. There's a gentleman called Danny Teasdale in Ullswater in the Lake District, he's an older gentleman. I'm sure he won't mind me saying that, but he's galvanising the local population, bringing the local population around him. He's a local farmer, and then he's helping them to work together as a network to then almost become a mechanism to allow that whole community to raise its GVA in all sorts of different ways, whether it's from environmental grants or from economic grants, or so that I think that sort of system of working on a valley by valley and an area by area or community, it's beginning to happen in this country, but it's much more in an organic way. Whereas in Japan, they've realised they've actually got to initiate the process and encourage these facilitation people to develop and go into these areas. And it would be good if DEFRA could look at something like this under the Shared Prosperity Fund to try and get some of these people to be facilitators rather than just expect people to do it as goodwill. And I think lots of these things have to be more professionalised and allow people this opportunity to do these sorts of things. And that would help keep people in rural areas. So they're trusted facilitators, so they help with new business development, they help fill paperwork in. We all know what that's like, it can be absolutely horrendous. So they help fill grant paperwork in, they organise community events, they do all sorts of stuff, all sorts of small things that help engage the local population to encourage them to develop their businesses and move on that extra step and perhaps get over some of the issues that they can't. They're an extra pair of hands in some instances, and they just go and help and get stuff going. The key to it, though, is that they live and work in the community. And I think that's absolutely essential, because it's not about people coming in from outside telling people what to do. These people go and immerse themselves in the local area. They become part of the community. And I think that's a really important lesson in the UK. It's about the Danny Teasdales. It's about people who have trust and respect in the communities that already are there. They're already working there. Perhaps they might have been there for 2 or 3 generations, or they've been there for a long time and they're trusted and respected. And these are the people that are key, I think, to unlocking a lot of the things that we need to be thinking about in upland areas. So the last thing is thinking about how we can value agricultural systems on a bigger scale. And one of the things that they introduced me to, which I hadn't even heard of, and I consider myself fairly well read, but I'm still learning all the time. They talked to me about something called geographically important agricultural heritage systems. And what this is an international scheme that's run by the FAO. And what they do is countries can identify places that have agricultural systems that have heritage value. And I'm sure some of you are thinking, hang on a minute, this sounds really interesting. And what they then do is then they can apply to the FAO to have that landscape designated as a GIAS site. And that becomes a brand which then the local population and the local economic development officers can then use to develop and support the traditional agricultural systems that they have that have high heritage value. And generally, GIAS sites don't exist in the developed world. And there are only 3 countries where these actually exist in the developed world. One of them is Japan, one of them is Spain, and one of them is Italy. And I think this is actually something we ought to be looking at. And I know people get a bit concerned and worried about, oh God, it's another designation. Oh, but this designation is about driving economic, social and environmental development in an area. It's not about putting a ring round somewhere and preserving it. It's about maintaining the agricultural system that produces the landscape and the livestock and the lifestyle and the sense of place and the cultural heritage. And that's what this does, this system. And I think that's worth exploring, perhaps particularly for some areas that don't have the luxury of having some other designation, like a World Heritage Site or a national park or whatever. And obviously that is roundabouts and swings for some areas. Being a national park can be fabulous, but it can also be a bloody nightmare, as can be a World Heritage Site. So what they've done here is that they've allowed to appreciate and support the different types of agricultural activity that go on in the uplands. And these are the 3 sort of systems you can see here. There's at the top of the hill, there's the production of the coppice and the charcoal, which is then processed and made into powder, which is then put in the food, which then adds value to it. And people go and buy interesting foodstuffs. There's the plum orchards in the middle, which are on 35-degree slopes, but they collect the plums and they process them and they add value because it's plums that come from this particular area, and it raises the profile. So you've got that whole economic engine going on in the background, which is the sort of thing that LEPs in this country perhaps ought to be thinking about. And then at the bottom of the hill, they've got the classic rice paddies that people go and take photographs, and this is where all the tourists turn up and take pictures and go, oh, isn't it lovely? But then the local economy of that is geared around the tourists so that they then get their cash and raise the GVA of the farming community in that way and the added value. So there are all sorts of different things going on in Japan, all sorts of little things that I felt were important that we might want to think about. So of course the issue is that is it adoptable in this country, these ideas, and are they appropriate? And so really what I tried to do was to split them into three. There you go. I'll get those. So basically, I think there are three ways we could look at what I learned from Japan. Is that there are those things which are appropriate in our upland context and adoptable. So they're the green things in the green ring. So I think they're the things that we ought to be focusing on, what people call the low-hanging fruit, if you want to use a crap analogy. So it's about reactivating farm wood management on farms through peripatetic practical woodland management, perhaps. It's thinking about exploiting weird markets and thinking about other food ingredients. It's thinking about agritourism, which I know it's difficult at the moment because of the current situation we're in, but we will come out of this pandemic. And when we do, we need to be ready to actually gear up so that we can support the hill farming sector in all the ways it needs to continue. And then the idea of these catalysing actors, I think, is really important as well. And these local people that encourage and innovate and are part of the community, I think they're really key to some of these processes to help drive through up the GVA and allow these farming communities to thrive rather than survive. And then there are things that perhaps we could think about, which are in the orange zone, and there are things that perhaps are not quite so appropriate because they require a bit more of a cultural shift. But you might get one or two farmers that suddenly think, well, actually, if I do that, I'll call the market and make loads of money. So I suspect that's what the wasabi farmers have done in Hampshire, is that they've seen a market. It's difficult to get fresh wasabi flown in from Japan. The price of it goes up even again because obviously you've got food miles, and they've seen a niche market. So it is adoptable, we can do it, but you do need quite a lot of technical know-how. You need to understand how those crops grow. You need to visit somewhere to understand the process. So the sorts of things I think we ought to be banging on about, and I'm thinking from my point of view in Cumbria, is that I think we ought to be trying to see whether the Shared Prosperity Fund could actually provide anything and use the LEP system to try and drive some of this, perhaps to get some sort of community farm shop grant scheme operating. I think we need to have what's called Akizuno Garden, which is their community project, which they set up, where the community came together to develop farm diversification academy type things. And thirdly, I think we ought to be pushing to look at this GS thing in relation to agricultural heritage systems, and just pushing up the agenda the importance of upland farming systems and the relationship with the upland environment that we have and the iconic landscapes that they produce. So I'd just like to end to thank the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust, because without them I wouldn't have been able to go, I wouldn't have been able to experience this. It was part funded by the Prince's Countryside Fund. And I'd also like to thank the people of Japan, who are not here to be thanked, but without them I would have learnt nothing. And I think they are very giving people, and they're really keen, and they're always thrilled when people come from the UK to visit them and give in hours and hours of time. And it was a very interesting experience. And if you ever do get the chance to go to Japan, take it, because it is a completely different way about thinking about the relationship with the world. And I think that's what I learned from it, is that there are different lessons that we can learn, that I think there is stuff we could do over here that would actually be better for hill farming in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lois. So during your presentation, there were a few questions that got raised in the chat. So shall I ask them now?
Yes, please.
So there's one that came fairly early on, and it was phrased as a question, so I'm going to rephrase it so it's more of a question. In Japan, is food considered a public good?
That is a really interesting point, and I think it would be, yes. I think their perception of it's so culturally central to their well-being and their life that I think they would consider it a public good. But if you, trying to explain the concept of a public good through an interpreter was quite interesting.
I bet. Okay. And then Anna asked a couple of questions. So the schemes that you talked about, so the wasabi growing, agritourism experiences, rent-a-paddy, all of the schemes that you referenced, does the government support these initiatives completely or partially, or are they privately funded?
It's arranged. The community project, which was visited by people from all over Southeast Asia, was from the community. The community put their money, their hands in their pockets, and they pooled resources to buy the old school, to do it up, to then run all these various enterprises. So some of them were privately owned, some of them were part public funded, and some were completely public funded and then cut loose, like the wayside community shops. So they were initiated, and then once they were set up, it was up to the community to then take on the financial burden and make sure they ran. So some, of course, failed, and some were awful, as I said, and some were just mind-blowing. You know, it was like going to Harold's Food Hall in the middle of nowhere. So yeah. It's a mixed bag.
Okay. And with the farm woodlands, how important are native trees in their design and management? And is there an aspect that is paramount? So examples were given of productivity, biodiversity, soil and flood management.
Right, that's a really good question. There's quite a lot in there. Forestry in Japan is really quite interesting because during the war, they pretty much cut everything down they could lay their hands on for the war effort. And then from 1945 onwards, they had a massive tree planting scheme. And what they did is they planted 2 species of tree, which they found grew very well in the Key Peninsula, and they planted them all over Japan. And so a lot of Japan is basically forested by 2 softwood species that we would call softwood species, but they actually behave like hardwoods. So they take hundreds of years to mature, and the rings, if you cut them through, the rings are really close together. So that in fact, even though they're softwood species, one of them is a cypress and the other one's a cedar, they actually behave like hardwoods. So that then explains why the Forest Guardian only harvests individual trees. They don't clear cut, because in Japan, if you clear cut a hillside, that hillside will be at the bottom of the valley within 2 days because of the number of earthquakes they have. So trees are really important in Japan from a natural hazard point of view. So that answers some of these other issues about the multifunctionality of forests in Japan, is they don't just see it as timber, it's actually part of their natural hazard management as well, because if you chop the trees down, the whole lot just falls down the hill. It also helps with water retention and biodiversity, but the biodiversity is not very good in these sorts of forests since 1945, because as you can imagine, with only 2 species of tree, there's not much living in those sorts of woods, but there are pockets of indigenous wood, and generally you find that the native woodland, the original woodland of Japan, you tend to find that in the Buddhist shrines around those areas, because in relation to Buddhism, you mustn't kill anything. That's completely anathema to Buddhism, so they don't chop the trees down. So all the trees around the shrines are still protected by their religion. So you tend to get these enclaves of natural woodland around the shrines, and then working out from that, once you're away from the shrine land, that's where you tend to end up with these 2 species of tree growing everywhere.
Great, thank you. Rod's asked a very good question, which I think we could have a whole session around as a standalone session. So the high price of land and housing in our uplands prevents young people living in rural areas. A change in our planning system would be needed to address this. How could our uplands become accessible to live and work in? What's needed?
Well, I think the keys are affordable housing and jobs that young people want to do. You know, I can speak from a position of being old. My daughter certainly wouldn't want to do what I do. So it's understanding what young people value and what they want to do in relation to jobs, and making sure those sorts of jobs are available in rural areas. I know there is a percentage of young people that want to continue the farming traditions and the woodland traditions. And for that, it's really important that we support our agricultural colleges. And I have to say that because for some of you who aren't from this part of the world, Newton Rig, our agricultural college, is under threat of closure. So it's just something that's very dear to my heart, that I think agricultural training needs to be in the heart of upland communities, because we need the next generation. We need to make sure that not only they have the skills that they need now, but they also need the skills and the knowledge for the future, because the world's changing, and their ability to be adaptable and to look at new ideas is going to be really crucial. So it's that ability to have skills, but they do need affordable housing. And the issue of affordable housing is massive, because it's just ridiculous, the price of housing now. And it is that need for planning policy to change, and for the government to recognise that if they want these rural areas to remain populated, and that in itself is a loaded question that I'm saying back to people, that if they want to maintain a rural population, then they will have to find ways of allowing those rural populations to stay in those areas. And at risk of getting too political, I don't really want to go any further on that one.
Yeah, I'm sure lots of people in this session also have thoughts around what's needed, so please share them in the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself and talk to that. So another question is, you've talked a lot about ideas that you've brought back from Japan. Are there any ideas from Cumbria that you've left in Japan?
Yeah, I'll tell you the weirdest thing that they got really excited about, and everybody in the ministry was chewing my arm off, is wonky vegetables. Because to them, imperfect fruit and vegetables is almost a crime, which is where we've come from. But then I was talking to them about the importance of wonky vegetables and the lower price that you can get them for, which was then helping with people that have a lower income, and therefore they could actually access a wider range of fruit and vegetables. And they were really interested in that. But what was interesting is when I went out into the rural areas, everybody in the rural areas was busy reprocessing the wonky fruit and the wonky vegetables and making it into other product, because they knew that they couldn't waste the crops and then they needed to do something with them. So that's why you ended up with 74 types of fruit juice and so on and so forth, because they were busy processing the stuff that wasn't that good. But the government had completely missed out what was going on even within their own communities. And this whole concept of wonky vegetables, they just thought was brilliant.
Great. And do you think there's a different mindset in Japan, which means that people are more accepting of change and more tuned into the marketing of products, coupled with Japanese attitude to food, which allows the farmers that you mentioned in the examples to be more experimental in their approaches?
I do think food is far more important over there than it is over here. I think people value it a lot more. I think that may change in our culture as we go past January 2021, and people may begin to value food perhaps a bit more than they had in the past, and a little bit more appreciation that home produced food is perhaps quite important, particularly when it hits your wallet. I think that the idea that they're more amenable to change is an interesting one, because Japanese society is very traditional. It's very rigid. They don't have particularly have a caste system like they do in India, but they do have a very rigid social system. And consequently, change is quite a difficult thing for them. So, but they've had to change because obviously when they came out of the Second World War, their country had basically been flattened and annihilated, and they had to completely rebuild. So they learnt to be adaptable, even though they don't particularly like it. They've realised that they've had to be adaptable in order to survive and then thrive as a nation. And I think that is one of their admirable qualities, is that they don't really invent things. What they do is they go and have a look at what everybody else is doing, take it home and adapt it for their own situation. And I think to me, that was the biggest lesson that I learned from them, is that I think we need to be less insular. And I think we need to go out and look at what other people are doing and learn from them, and actually think, well, that might not work for us, but perhaps we could adapt it and look at it in a different way.
talking of adapting, Helen mentioned that in Totnes they have a project similar to the rent-a-paddy idea, with a community bred wheat plot on a farm. Do you think something like this would work well for the demographics of the Lakes area and its towns? And do you have ideas for what you think could work?
It's interesting. I'm really pleased that they've got something going in Totnes, but I think I could probably speak for quite a lot of people. We all know that Totnes is a bit of a wild place down there in Devon, and that you do tend to do quite innovative things. But I think society is now changing. I think if we had this conversation a year ago, some of the things I was talking about, people found quite radical. But I think with the situation we're currently facing and the way in which the world's going to change in the next 6 to 8 months, I think we need to be more adaptable. We all do. I've had to adapt the way I work in the university and how I teach young people, because the way I like to teach is no longer available to me. So I have to learn to adapt, because if we don't adapt, we don't survive. And it's a really hard lesson, and it's a really, I found it really quite stressful from my point of view of having to change habits of a lifetime. And I think we are all going to have to do things differently if we want to maintain the landscape and the way of life that we actually want.
So those are all the questions that have been shared so far. So if anyone has any more, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions directly, then you don't have to hear me so much.
I'm happy to come and talk to anybody anywhere, about this stuff in more detail. If people want me to send them a copy of my report, it's got lots of coloured pictures in it, because I don't like writing reports with lots of words in, but it's got lots of pictures of Japan in it, so I'm quite happy to email that to anybody. And the other thing I would say is that if you want to learn from another culture and you think there's an opportunity for you, is to have a look at a Winston Churchill Fellowship, because they're really keen that more people from rural areas that want to tackle rural issues get involved in the Churchill Fellowship scheme. And it's a very generous scheme, and it's absolutely worthwhile. So do use it, and it's open to anybody. I'm very unusual. They don't tend to give them to academics because they think we're just going to go away and write academic papers and make our names. And I'm afraid I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in getting ideas out there. So do it. Hello, Neil.
Thanks, Lois, and thanks for a brilliant presentation. It was really interesting. I wondered if you could give us more detail on the agricultural heritage systems that you were talking about and the FAO designations and how you might go about sort of looking into that.
Okay. Oh God, I knew you'd ask me something complicated. Unfortunately, I've got my notebook here because obviously I went over a year ago and it's remembering stuff. But what they have is that there are 5 criteria that you have to fulfill in order to do a GIAS scheme, which you can go and look on the FAO website, the international website, and you can actually, it outlines what you have to do. It's a national application, so we'd have to go through DEFRA or DCMS or a combination of the two to do it, because it's considered a cultural designation, but it's also an agricultural one. So that'll be an interesting nightmare, because we know how wonderfully our ministries work with each other when it comes to joint schemes. And that actually is a really important point I've forgotten to make, is in Japan, the ministries don't work together. And then suddenly they realise that actually perhaps they should work together, because they're all looking at issues that are related. And this last year, they actually had an act of parliament that forces them to work together when they have a rural development issue that needs to be looked at in a number of different ways. And it actually has forced the ministries to actually start talking to each other. And actually you get a more integrated solution, and the integrated solutions seem to be the most effective. But with GIAS, I'm still looking. I knew you'd ask me something difficult, Neil, because that's just you all over. I'm just trying to look. I
can have a look on the website. It's fine.
Yeah, but there are 5 criteria. And then I think that we would easily hit all those 5 criteria, any upland area in this country, because they're all agricultural heritage systems. It doesn't matter whether it's a national park or an AONB or not even designated. I know that our uplands would actually hit all those ticks.
Right. Oh, that's really interesting. That it's actually about the agricultural system than it is about, like you said, than it is necessarily about land designations.
No,
So
it's
yeah,
not about that. It's
yeah,
about perpetuating that agricultural heritage system, so that it's all about, you know, it's about traditional farming systems in Ghana or wherever it is. It's about traditional farming systems, and I don't think we make enough of our traditional farming systems in this country, and we need to push it
no.
more.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Just to point out, oh no, it's been shared with me. Anna shared with me the selection criteria, so I'll share it to everyone.
Hey. Oh, somebody's quick off the mark there. Woohoo.
Yeah, we've got great people.
There you go.
Any other questions? Rod?
With the heritage thing you were talking about, it seems as though things like sort of hay meadows and the old ways of making hay might be something that could come into that. You know,
Yes,
if you're making sort of pikes and all sorts of things that used to be done. We've also had people on the farm making things like swill baskets. So there's quite a lot of woodland craft things that come into the heritage side. Swills, clogs, all sorts of things like that. But we've found, the thing that we've always found, is we've had quite a number of people through the farm who've ended up making things like that, but they've always struggled to make a living from it. And certainly, you know, they've never been able to afford to live in the area, so they all live in yurts or things like that to survive.
And I suppose that's a really interesting point. And I think that's where we need to be thinking about how we market this product. And instead of individuals having to try and struggle to do that, that there needs to be a better holistic system. The nearest parallel I suppose I could draw that I'm familiar with is the Orkney hampers that you have on Orkney, where the foodstuffs come in from all over the various islands, and then the hampers are actually produced and sold by one company that gather it all together. And perhaps we need to be this idea of the wayside shops that the Japanese use. It's bringing it into one location where you have more people, rather than trying to be an independent salesperson. And again, you know, none of us have all the skills. Some of us are very good at marketing. Some of us are very good at talking for England, and some of us, you know, are really good at making swill baskets. And it's that ability to work out where your skill deficit is, and then find ways to support these various small businesses to actually allow them to actually up the financial value and also the sales outputs for them, I think.
We've sort of talked about that in Lancaster with bringing some of the traders who come into market, where it's quite difficult to make a living from bringing a market stall, but by combining a whole lot of people together, it might be much more viable to make a living from it. I think that's a really good idea to work with that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Helen's asked a question. Did all farmers engage with community selling activities, or were there people who largely went their own way?
Oh no, there were some that I met that were in hyperdrive and were completely independent from everybody else. There was one little old lady I met who was 93, and she had her own factory out the back of her farmhouse. It was just bolted onto the side, and she produced her own food boxes, which she sent all over Japan, because she'd been doing it for so long that her product had become well known across the whole of Japan, and so people would buy it as a Christmas hamper for their relatives and so on and so forth. So not all of them played the game and were part of the community, and there were communities that were busy at each other's throats. Because there's so small populations in a lot of communities now, the Japanese government are actually stopping some communities from functioning on their own anymore, and they're forcing them to work together, because instead of being a population of 30, they make 3 villages work together and become a population of 90. And then one has the doctors, one has the primary school, and one has the shop. And they have to work more collaboratively together, because they can't afford the Japanese health system. They can't afford to have a doctors in each one. And we know the sorts of issues that we get in rural areas for ourselves. So government policy was helping making villages work together more effectively in a more sort of collaborative way. Did I answer the question, or did I get off the subject?
I think you answered it. But
Okay.
Helen,
It's Adam, actually, not Helen.
all right. Sorry.
Helen's here as well.
Do you have another question? All right, great.
No, just expanding on that question, really, I was thinking that there are really notable farmers here who do sell their own stuff, but I wouldn't say that. I would say that's kind of, quite a small percentage of the population, the farming population here, that actually engage with that side of things. I think a lot of people that passes by. So I wondered if there were, I wondered if on the whole, the Japanese farmers in those little communities, if it was kind of a high percentage that were selling their products direct, or if it was kind of similar to here, where there are these notable people doing it, but actually the majority kind of not doing it that way. I'm guessing that you're going to say that that quite a lot of people are selling direct because they're maybe the systems are a bit different. You said that they're quite small scale and manual, whereas perhaps our farms are geared towards that kind of industrial food system, really.
I will say it depends, because there were people that were totally engaged with farm diversification. There were others that didn't want to know anything about it. And then there were others where a lot of small farmers, it's financially almost too expensive for them to even take their goods to market. So what the Japanese government have put in place is like a collection point. So it's a bit like a marketing board, but not a marketing board in miniature, so that people would actually drive their product to a location. There'd be a lorry there, and everybody would load all their product onto this lorry, so like 30 or 40 farmers, and then that lorry would take it off and it would be put into a cooperative or a food system or another business, and then processed in that way. So they've looked at the transport issue, because in rural Japan, because lots of people are very old and lots of people can't even afford vehicles. Some of the tuk-tuks, I suppose is the best way, to the three-wheelers that I saw, were just almost on their knees, really. And that was a way of making sure that these people didn't become so isolated that they couldn't actually engage with the marketing process, because they realised that there's a percentage of farmers in these areas that are so isolated they can't even engage with the marketing process. And they needed to put something in place to allow them to engage.
I wonder if
it's a mixed bag. Sorry.
I wonder if early on in your talk you kind of suggested that the rural depopulation in Japan's been happening in the last, since 1945, and you sort of compared that to rural depopulation here in the 1900s, and I wonder if in some extent we've kind of gone below the critical mass. I don't know if we're used to working together in that way, because there's not enough of us.
Yeah.
In the same way with I mean, I suppose maybe on the commons there's a little bit more of that communal stuff goes on. And I don't know if anyone else wants to tell me I'm talking rubbish, because I might be.
It's a good point. I do think that their depopulation has been so rapid that they've almost been forced together to function, because they know if they don't work together, they're absolutely knackered. The point you made about we've dropped below the threshold of survival, I think is a really interesting question. And my heart is saying one thing and my head's saying another.
Okay.
I mean, there are other people here in this session. I wonder what do you think to Adam's point? Do you feel we've gone below the threshold from your own experience?
I suppose what I mean is I'm not sure that we're that used to working collaboratively. I think a lot of people are very wrapped up on their own farm, and you know, a lot of the go-getting people that are direct selling or diversifying, it's within their own farm, it's through like accommodation businesses or through direct sales of products or whatever, and you know, they look quite successful. We are quite small, and we'd probably benefit from cooperative marketing. But my feeling is that we'd have to do that ourselves, which we haven't really sort of quite got the energy for.
Yeah, and
you know, to be the person kind of leading that.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm being quite down. I don't mean to be.
No,
but you've got a valid point. You know, on a practical, pragmatic level, this is part of the issue in Uplands in this country, is that people are spending so much time just making the farm work that they don't have time to devote to do alternative enterprises and get engaged in community projects and so on and so forth. But I suppose we're almost at a point where if we don't, are we dead in the water? You know, and this is why this project that Danny Teasdale's got off the ground in the Oleswater catchment is so interesting, because it is a collection of people who are working 17 hours a day, but they have realised that if they don't do something, their community is going to implode on itself. And by working together, if they will donate 2 hours or whatever it is, then perhaps they can actually make a better deal of it. But it's making sure that the systems are in place to support that, because people can't donate full time. You know, poor old Danny now, 50% of his life is filled up with this, running this, he's formed a CIC, and 50% of his life is doing that. And it's that facilitation that the government needs to step in and actually promote, and actually recognise that if you get that promotion going, it becomes a self-fulfilling system. It's like one of those perpetual motion wheel things that once you start it going, it doesn't stop, like one of those woodpecker things you used to get. And you need an intervention to push it into operation, and the intervention is labour. I think the intervention that's needed is these sort of community caravan type people at that intervention level to actually allow some of these things to happen, that go beyond the farm gate and allow people to have that opportunity, because at the moment it's really difficult to find that additional time.
So Neil has a point. I just want to raise something that's been shared in the chat as well, that so there are people that want to start or move into farming but can't get onto the land, which brings up the issue of land ownership. But anyway, we'll park that big elephant and then come back to it after Neil.
Yeah, it was just to follow on from what Lois said just a couple of seconds ago about Danny, what Danny's doing, and sort of almost filling a position of possibly even marketing or whatever a role, because the people you're working for are actually doing 17 hours a day, and the fact that they're having to do 17 hours a day and can't get themselves out of that is almost the biggest issue for me. And within rural communities, not only are we not necessarily making a great deal of money from our farms and our farming activities, but it's taking up a lot of our lives to achieve that, which makes even less sense. And it's almost that we need to sort of be trying to address, so that those people themselves can get out there and do the marketing and sort of concentrate more on the selling of the products and working together as a community that is critical to what we're trying to achieve, and get them out of that sort of mindset that it's just farming 100% of the time. But how we do that, I don't know.
Magic wand.
Yeah.
I've got my magic Brexit wand here, and it's all just going to happen. It's going to be wonderful.
Yeah.
We're all going to be skipping through the bluebells.
Yeah.
Thomas.
Yeah, I mean, I do like that idea of the community caravan, or kind of some sort of adaptation of that. I think could be interesting, because I think it was me who threw the cat amongst the pigeons there with that. Basically, access to land is a massive issue for young people. You know, so basically, I train people who want access to land, and they're getting the skills, they're learning, and a lot of people go woofing and working on basically because they want to engage with the land, and then they hit that brick wall of I actually can't get my foot on a piece of land and then work that myself. And so like having maybe some sort of cross-generational work with, basically we've got two issues. We've got like all these young people who want access to lands, can't get there. We've got this aging farming population who basically basically working on their basically are basically losing the power to work the land. So some sort of cross-generational initiative, where actually these two constituencies are brought together and work out how to work the land together in the future. I mean, that might be.
That's a really interesting point, because they tried that in Cumbria. It was called the Fell Farming Traineeship Scheme.
Right.
And they linked up farmers that didn't have successors with young people who wanted to get into farming. And they ran the scheme for 5 years. It was a leader project. And then they rolled it out in the North York Moors as well, which has got a bigger, even bigger succession problem. I don't know if there's anybody from the Moors on this call. And that allowed farmers who couldn't afford a full wage, they afforded a 0.2 wage. So, and the young person would move around the 5 farms, and they get put a day a week on a different farm, and it introduced them to different farming systems and different ways of thinking about managing a landscape. And for some of them, it's actually then allowed them to become the successor on one of those farms.
Right, so that has actually worked successfully in some cases.
Yeah, it's worked, but it's really tiny. It was a pilot, and it's about upscaling these things, I think, is the next step, isn't it?
Great. Is there something written up about that can be shared?
Yeah, I've got something somewhere on that. Yeah.
Oh, that'd be fascinating.
So is it not running anymore? It was a pilot.
No, it was a pilot project through Leader.
Thank you.
Rod, you reappeared. Does that mean you have another question?
No. Have we dried up? Are we all exhausted? I know I am.
Oh, Rod has unmuted.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, it's fascinating the way you're talking about these little added value projects. I mean, one of the things I've been working on is I've got 200 varieties of apple, and it's almost impossible to sell them as individual apples. So what I'm now doing is made it into cider vinegar, and now I'm using all the sort of countryside flavors. So I'm using hawthorn, blackthorn, and flavors like that to add to the vinegar. So we can get a sort of really specialist vinegar that I'm hoping will sell at a price that makes it viable. It takes sort of 3 years to make it, to get it right, but it's something very special. But it's that, there's so many skills involved in that. That sort of, at the moment, I'm at the stage of trying to design the bottles. So actually sort of, getting the bottle shape right and getting the label right. And it's every step of the way, you've got to learn a new skill. And that's really where a sort of a community working together will help bring all those skills together. So that it makes it a faster step to get to a product that's viable.
And it's those communities networking with each other as well to say, well, we've got somebody who can design bottles, we've got somebody who can do labels, we can get somebody who does this. And so you actually end up with a network of smaller communities actually sharing skills with each other. But all that takes time, and all that takes facilitation that sits outside the farm gate. And that to me is the big hurdle, is that labour issue, so that you don't end up having to learn 25 processes.
I have a question. So I have a role with the Sustainable Food Places Initiative in Lancaster, which is called Food Futures, and we cover North Lancashire area. And a lot of the Sustainable Food Place initiatives are doing what you're describing. They're setting up communities of active citizens who offer to do days of labour on local farms, set up community growing projects. support open farm events, run local food events in the city, like we've been running seasonal markets here, etc. But one pattern that I've seen in the networks around the country is that they tend to be quite urban based. And so you get really active people in the city. Like, I think we have an amazing network here of people in Lancaster, but to actually find the time to be able to build that connection up stronger between the rural areas and where some of the food comes from our area, which some of it does come from the lakes in Cumbria, but a lot of the farms that we've tried to link with are too busy to like engage at all. Like, if we run a market, people will come, and that's a chance to chat and find out more about how to build that. But I have a question of, how do we build that link better? From my perspective as someone who's running a network in a city, how can we better support and work with hill farmers? How would people respond to that?
I wouldn't like to answer for the hill farmer community on that one. But it's this whole labour issue. It is, we've got to break that somehow. We've got to it's almost like being on a bike and some horrible child putting a stick in your wheel and you go over the handlebars. It's a bad analogy, but in a way we need almost what's called boringly a parametric shot to actually push us over the edge to actually try and find that solution to that labour issue, because that's the crunch.
So supporting with the labour issue is crucial.
Yeah.
So whether that's through mentoring schemes, people going to stay in areas and support on farms, offering time
just
to
need
do
to be more
marketing.
creative. I think we're just going to have to change as a society. I think we're all guilty of being too insular. I know I am. If I can avoid doing something differently, I'll do it. I'll do it. Carry on doing it. But you know, there comes a point where you feel like you're either in or you're out, really.
Tim has shared a comment in the chat. I feel like I should read it out loud so everyone has a chance to hear it. So Tim says, less time farming, more time marketing, or every farmer needs a marketing partner. How many farmers know where their product will be sold when they start producing it? That's an interesting question. I was interested to hear an arable farmer saying he had never in his life grown any crop that he didn't already have a market for when he planted it. Upland farmers need to be the same somehow.
Wow. That's quite loaded, isn't it?
Yeah.
Given it's 3 minutes to 9, I don't think I want to go there, because there's quite a lot in there to unpack, isn't there? But it's a valid point that it is, you know, a lot of these skills we don't take too naturally, but we need them, and it's finding a way to provide those skills either to the individual that feels comfortable learning those skills, or finding a way to provide that at a central point where people can then use it.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that draws us to a natural conclusion. So I'm going to stop recording.